Director of UK Lawyers for Israel, Natasha Hausdorff, was giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee on Tuesday, which is chaired by Labour MP Emily Thornberry. Thornberry has previously been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. He made statements in the Commons over Israel's actions during the Great March of Return, for example. However, during Israel's siege of Gaza, she has held some dubious positions, such as defending Keir Starmer's statements to LBC over the Israeli blockade in the wake of October the 7th. Let's see what happened in the committee when Hausdorff and Thornberry clashed over the future for Palestinians in Gaza.
So your future for Israel is a fairly positive one. The economy doing well, being at peace with its neighbours, dealing with the Iranian threat and the threat from Iranian proxies. That's one side. And so I suppose the other side, given that we're looking at peace for Israel and Palestine, is what would be the future of a Palestinian living in Gaza? What would be the future of a Palestinian living on the West Bank?
I think that ultimately depends on whether the international community continues down the tried and tested mechanism of encouraging extremism, unfortunately, amongst Palestinian terrorist groups. We've seen that vis-à-vis Hamas, we've seen that vis-à-vis Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, elements of the so-called moderates in the West Bank. Until and unless the two driving factors of the worsening situation for the Palestinians, namely indoctrination to terror and incentivization to terror, until those are addressed and until international complicity in those issues and the perpetuation of the conflict through that is addressed, my projection, if you will, or my hopes for a similar positive reality are less optimistic. It's one of the reasons I've made it a significant mission, travelling around the world and meeting with politicians and officials, to stress the importance of ceasing funding for UNRWA, which is at the core...
Wait, sorry, may I just so that I get this. So if I was a Palestinian mother in Gaza or on the West Bank, I would be looking to... my future would be what? It all depends on whether the West are helping to develop extremism within Hamas?
Well, I think the future of any Palestinian in Gaza ultimately depends on whether or not Hamas is defeated, right. Which is, of course, one of Israel's central war aims.
Interesting that she's trying to claim there that there's somehow an incentive to terrorism through it being spread by Western governments, for example, when basically everybody in the West and lots of countries around the world keep saying, forcing people to condemn Hamas, as if that isn't the obvious position that loads of people are taking. And she talks about incentive to terrorism. Well, that would be the illegal occupation of Palestine by Israel, the military, the belligerent occupation of which, under international law, they have every right to resist. Again, there should be no justification for attacks on civilians, never. However, attacks on military targets that are done to break that military occupation is the right of the Palestinians to resist under international law. That is the incentive, is the occupation that's there. You want to get rid of the incentive, you can get rid of the occupation. Let's look at some more of that exchange.
You're quite confident that Israel is going to be successful, that Israel is going to defeat Iran and Iranian proxies. So then the question is, what happens then? What does peace look like for Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza? I'm sorry I keep asking, I just want an answer to that.
I think I put it in terms of being cautiously optimistic.
What does cautiously optimistic mean?
Well, cautiously optimistic, I don't say that it is easy to defeat Iranian threats, in particular where one sees the international community moving to policies of appeasement and complacency in grappling with these threats.
Let's get away from those sorts of words. Yes. Let's just talk about what's the future. So you're saying there's a positive future, you're optimistic. So what's the optimistic, positive future for a Palestinian mother in Gaza at the moment or on the West Bank? What's the best thing that could happen?
The best thing that could happen is the ending of the indoctrination and the incentivization to terror, to give ordinary Palestinians a chance. And through that, I think the removal...
What does a chance look like? What does it mean?
Through the removal of the genocidal Islamist regime in Gaza and the corrupt Palestinian Authority
I'm so
And the
sorry.
creation
I'm
of
so sorry. What does a chance look like? Let's take away all the words. Right? Let's take away all of those descriptions. Let's keep ourselves calm.
Let me give you a
and just I'm going to have, this is my last try. What does a positive future look like for Palestinians living in Gaza or on the West Bank? What's the best thing we can hope for?
Perhaps I can give you a practical example. When I've visited Ramallah, the biggest cause for optimism I have seen is a visit to a venture capital startup fund looking to create Silicon Valley, a startup culture in the West Bank, in Ramallah, specifically looking to create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society that can hold its corrupt leadership to account. Mahmoud Abbas, let's not forget, is in the 20th year of his 4-year term. The oppression, the brutal oppression, it's remarkable that there hasn't been more international media attention on the torture that the Palestinian Authority metes out to political opponents in the West Bank. That, if you ask me, and it's reflected in polls across the West Bank by Palestinian organisations, that has ultimately got to be the biggest prospect for the chance that I'm talking about.
Okay, so if I have this correct, the best thing that Palestinians can hope for is they have some kind of venture capital startup fund and a startup culture, just random kind of what was the family capital thing that the right go on about in the UK. This would be much easier, Natasha. This would be much, much easier if there was no blockade, if there was no wall, if there was no occupation. There was a thriving citrus industry, for example, in Palestine before the occupation by Israel. And the Israeli occupation essentially neutered and destroyed that industry through border checks and through continual blocking of these goods moving out of Palestine, which left these citruses to be able to rot at the border, right? They continue to put so many disincentives on economic activity in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank through these blockades, which is why all of these statements you hear from people about how, oh, well, because of the unilateral disengagement of Ariel Sharon, they could have made Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East, which of course is completely impossible when you are hemmed in an open-air prison by a colonial occupier. It's such genuine kind of delusion to think that was ever going to be the case because they don't have the ability to freely trade with people, which is one of the basics of being able to have a thriving economy in the first place. Thornberry also pressured her over the borders of the state of Israel.
So your position essentially is that since the British mandate was all of the land up to the river in 48, that Israel is the whole of that area as well.
Well, of course, the original mandate was far bigger.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
So let's not go into past history. Let's just try and stick to.
Well,
wait a minute.
The question. It is important because this rule applies to the administrative lines of the mandate. The administrative line that had previously divided Transjordan, what later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, from the rest of the mandate, is the line that ran all the way down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea.
Yes.
And that, under this universal customary rule, that is the only line in play when Israel declares independence.
So that's where I wanted to start, right?
Yes.
So that's your position. Now, the question is, though, it's not the position, because we've not heard from the Israeli government. But it's not the Israeli government's position, is it?
The Israeli government has...
The Israeli government position is not that Israel's borders go from the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, is it?
May I take a moment to answer? Because you are skipping through decades of history and policy.
But what I want to do is just because we're missing the Israeli government here, I just want to make sure that I haven't missed something.
Well,
it's not the Israeli government's position that Israel begins at the River Jordan and finishes at the Mediterranean Sea, is it?
I'm not here to represent the Israeli government.
No, I just want to make sure that I've got that.
I'm speaking to the application of international law, real international law, that is universal.
Which the Israeli government is not applying.
Well, that's not accurate. And if I may be permitted to answer the question, perhaps the committee will follow the response. What Uti Possidetis Juris does is it tells us the starting point. This is the position in 1948. It is in fact endorsed by all subsequent agreements, the armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan in 1949, and later on also the peace agreements, only refer back to those mandatory lines, administrative lines of the British Mandate. That is significant. What happens in 1967 when Israel recovers the relevant territory, the disputed territory that had previously been under Jordanian occupation? This is the parts of East Jerusalem and the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, is that it treated those territories differently. The Israeli government applied its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to East Jerusalem. And critically, Abba Evan, who was the foreign minister at the time, writes to the UN Secretary General in 1967 and says this is not annexation.
Exactly.
Which is because one cannot annex what is already one's own sovereign territory.
For further clarity on Hausdorff's position over Israel's borders, this is a statement she made in an article for the Jewish Chronicle in 2020. Analysis of the status of the territory in international law takes us to the origins of the State of Israel. The universal rule for determining borders for emerging states, Oedipus Sedatis Juris, dictates that such states are established with the same boundaries of the prior administrative entity of the land unless otherwise agreed. Under this principle of international law, as the only state to emerge from the British Mandate on the 14th of May 1948, Israel automatically inherited the mandatory boundaries as its own borders. The eastern border ran along the Jordan River all the way down to the Red Sea, originally dividing the British administrative units of Palestine and Transjordan. This is contradicted by the Israeli Provisional Government's own letter to the White House, which stated in 1948 that the State of Israel had been proclaimed as an independent republic, with frontiers approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations in its resolution of November 29, 1947, as per the partition plan. It was the All-Palestine government in 1948 that did claim to be the successor state to the British Mandate in its declaration on October 1, 1948, of an independent, free and democratic sovereign state of Palestine. It is also not the view of the International Court of Justice. Following last year's case on Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, their advisory panel stated this: restitution includes Israel's obligation to return the land and other immovable property, as well as all assets seized from any natural or legal person started since its occupation in 1967. And on top of this as well, even if they wanted to claim all of the territory between the river and the sea, even if they did want to do that, and it's clear from the Likud Party kind of foundational documents that they do want to do that, then they don't actually want the territory with the Palestinians in it. They don't want the Palestinians to become citizens of Israel, because that would undermine the demographic majority that makes up the fact that Israel is an ethno-state. This is why we live in this limbo where lots of people will allude to Israel's borders as being from the river to the sea, but at no point will Israel actually administer anything other than the area of the West Bank that is designated under Israeli civilian law as being part of their territory, because it's where Palestinians don't live. They don't want these people to be citizens, which is why this limbo continues, right? That's why we live in this continual perpetual state of occupation, because they don't want a Palestinian state established because they believe that it's all their territory, but they don't want to absorb the population either, because they want to maintain a demographic majority. And that's why we have gotten to this situation, why it seems to be unsalvageable, especially when people like Netanyahu are in government in Israel. Harriet, what did you make of this exchange?
Now, Helena, I'm no fancy lawyer here, not like Natasha, who we just heard, but I think that what that was is a really great example of what Israel and its lobbyists continually do. They muddy the water, they tie themselves in linguistic knots, they refuse to answer the questions, there's a real deliberate attempt to obscure the truth, and there are outright lies that get told over and over again. We know that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal. We know that it's settler colonialism. We know that there is an apartheid state that is functioning there. And we know that the international community's response to Israel's illegal occupation is to normalize it instead of challenging it. And that is why there is no sense of normality, there is no sense of justice, and that's why Palestinian lives seem to be absolutely worthless in the region where they live, in their homeland, and everywhere else around the world, with some notable exceptions in terms of countries that have stood with the Palestinian people. In that exchange on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee between Thornberry and the Director of UK Lawyers for Israel, it continues to be really interesting if you watch the whole thing. So the Director of UK Lawyers for Israel says that there is no starvation that is happening in Gaza at the moment, and denies that an Israeli blockade of aid is actually creating a hunger crisis in Gaza. This is not true. The UN has called this a deliberate dismantling of Palestinian life. For 8 weeks, no aid, no food, and no medicine has been allowed into Gaza. That is what the Israeli government and the Israeli military has done. That is an indisputable fact, and there is no getting away from it. We also know, as of today, that life expectancy in Gaza has dropped from just over 75 years old to just 40 years. That's 35 years wiped off Gazan people's life expectancy. And the the director of UK Lawyers for Israel can obfuscate, and she can tie herself into knots and use all this really complex legal language and refuse to answer questions as much as she likes. But these are the realities on the ground, and we can see it. We can see what is happening, and nothing that any of Israel's lobbyists say is going to change that.